So welcome, hello everyone, to our alumni of the University of Toronto's Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering, and to all of our alumni and guests tuning in from all over the world. We'd love if you could type in what part of the world you're tuning in from in the chat feature to share with our audience today. Welcome to everyone. My name is Sonia DeBulio, and I'm the Director of Alumni Relations for the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering. Thank you for joining us here today for our first School Lunch and Learn of the season, featuring Professor Mark Fox from the University of Toronto's School of Cities. Before starting, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Just a quick housekeeping item. Please send your questions to our speaker today in the group chat section. He will be answering questions at the end of the session. We have staff who are pulling together all of your questions, including those that were sent in during the registration, so they don't get lost. And we'll help get the speaker get through as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. Now, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to pass the reins over to the chair of the Lunch and Learn program, Laurie Hevola. Laurie is an Electrical 65 graduate and one of our most dedicated and engaged members of our alumni community. Back when our Lunch and Learn programs were held at the Faculty Club on campus, many of you will recall that Laurie would act as MC for all of our events. As we have transitioned to virtual events over the past few months, we are happy to have Laurie and many of our volunteers back on board to help us to continue our alumni traditions beyond campus, reaching our alumni communities globally. Without further ado, I will pass it over to Laurie to welcome our speaker for today's event. Over to you, Laurie.
Thank you, Sonia. First Lunch and Learn was started by the class of 3T5, and many years later was taken over by the class of 5T3, and many of the members of 5T3 are still on the executive. There are two of us from the 60s that are now joined up the 5T3 members with the Lunch and Learn program. Today is the first of this season's programs. All of the programs are supported by a partnership with the U of T affinity partner MBNA. Now to move on to our guest speaker, of course, is Professor Mark Fox. He is a distinguished professor of urban systems engineering, professor of industrial engineering and computer science, associate director research for the School of Cities, and a founding director of the Center for Social Services Engineering here at U of T. He's also an entrepreneur, having co-founded the Carnegie Group in 1984, which was a software company that specialized in artificial intelligence-based systems, and he co-founded and was CEO of Novator Systems, a pioneer in e-retail software and services. Mark is a fellow of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, a member of the IEEE, and the Engineering Institute of Canada. And over his illustrious career, he has published over 200 papers. And on that note, I will please join us in welcoming Mark Fox on the operating system of future cities. Mark?
Thank you very much, Laurie and Sonia. Opportunity to speak to the engineering alumni. As Laurie did, I'm a professor of engineering and computer science. I've been in originally the Department of Industrial Engineering and more recently mechanical and industrial engineering since 1991. So I've been around for a while here, and I know that I saw some familiar names in the list of those who have registered. Thank you very much for showing up and being part of this lunch. The topic of my presentation is on the operating system for future cities, and the question really is, what does that mean? So I'll start off by saying that with rapid urbanization occurring throughout the world, countries have focused on creating smart cities as a means to achieve sustainable and resilient urban development. Over the last decade, we have seen a growing number of smart challenges, projects, and technologies in the areas of transportation, health, security, to name a few. The question I wish to explore is, what is the digital infrastructure that lurks below the flash and hype of smart cities, and understand the change that must occur if we are to realize a future city where sustainability, resilience, quality, and equality of life are achieved. So in my presentation today, I'm going to go through 5 parts. First is going to be on what is the city operating system, so that we're all on the same page. Then I'm going to talk about behavioral requirements, which is in some sense the core of what I want to present today. And then I'm going to focus on 2 different technologies that I have been working on for the last 40 years, and others around the world are working on, with intelligent agents and city data and ontologies, and then I will conclude. So to begin with, trying to answer, what is a city operating system? So Townsend is a noted author on the topic of smart cities. He came out with a book in 2013 on the topic, and he wrote that an urban operating system would handle tasks like processing your payment for a taxi fare, send traffic road sensor readings up to a server in the cloud, or verifying a resident's identity when they approach the door of their home. As the bits of the smart city interact with each other, the urban operating system will broker the exchange. Now, another author, DeWall, wrote that data is fed into the system that aggregates its information in real time and can be used in different contexts, which may lead to semantic knowledge bases. And as an example, you can ask your informatics device questions like, what is the best place with regard to my current location weather forecast? Sadly, these definitions leave much to be desired. Why? Well, let's go back and think about what a city is. A city is much more than what they're talking about. A city is composed of many different service areas. There's a huge education component to a city. There's a huge transportation component to the city, water and sewage processing, social services that are being provided, public health that's being provided, public safety, fire and emergency, parks and recreation, housing, affordable housing, and it goes on the list of services that a city provides. Billions of dollars are being spent every year by the city on all of these areas. And a smart city is going to be one that recognizes me when I come to my front door. They're nice, but these represent facile applications. They represent a view of a smart city that I think only addresses a small, minimal part of what goes on in the city. But the problem is that cities have evolved over centuries, and the services that they provide have evolved separately, forming silos separated by language, process, and independence. And so when we look at the services that a city provides, they are spread across these silos that are separated in language, in processes, etc., that limit their ability to do one very important thing, and that is the ability to coordinate. So let's consider the following example. If you want to pave a road, let's say you're in the public works area of the city, and you want to pave a road, what does that entail? What does that department do? Well, of course they send out some type of tender or request for proposal that's sent out to the variety of contractors that are out there. They include in that tender that the area that needs to be paved, what the constraints or requirements are, and the paving, the materials, things of that nature, and the period of time over which it's going to be done. Is it that simple? I mean, it's not simple, but relatively speaking, is it that simple? The answer is no. If you want to pave a road and you're going to open up the street, if you want to ask the water department, water and sanitation, do we want to replace the water lines now that we're opening up the road? Do we want to talk to the sewage side and say, do we want to replace the sewer lines that are sitting under that road? If we're going to open the road, do we want to modify or upgrade or add new power lines or other telecommunication lines that are possibly underneath the road, or put them underneath the road if we're burying all of our power lines? Do we need to contact the part of the city that gives permits for usage of the city so that the people who have permits, such as the Santa Claus Parade, know that this is going to take place and what they had a permit for may no longer be possible? Do we need to inform the police so that they can coordinate their participation, keeping people away, modifying things that are going to occur in that area? Do we need to speak to the transportation department and ask whether they have major routes that go through that street and what needs to be done to reroute them? And finally, do we need to speak to the businesses to understand what the impact is going to be, whether we're taking down that road and access to their businesses during a time when it's their peak business season? So the bottom line is the task of paving a road is not as simple as just finding a contractor to pave the road. It is an act of coordination that has to occur across many of the different silos within the city, and sadly, often, they are not very well coordinated. So the bottom line is that broadly focused tasks, such as infrastructure projects or social services, require a high degree of coordination across city services to be effective and efficient, which in turn require greater integration of both data and processes. So the question is, what is being done to address this problem from a smart cities perspective? Well, let's take a look at a few examples. If you go and you search the literature on smart cities, the popular literature, there's a great deal more depth if you go into the scientific literature, but let's look at the popular literature. We see things like smart street lights, which if somebody's walking by, grow brighter, and when there's nobody there, are less bright, so you conserve energy. We see things like smart garbage cans, which communicate to the garbage collector when it is that they are full and need to be emptied. We see smart fountains which coordinate their movements with lights and don't operate during times when nobody's there to conserve water and energy. We see smart traffic lights as an application where the goal is to hurry more cars through in any given time period through the use of image recognition systems, car counters, et cetera, et cetera. These are best characterized as narrowly focused applications, and narrowly focused in the sense that they minimize interactions with other city services, but also minimize impact. In essence, they're a spot application that they're done in such a way that they don't have to affect a lot of the other parts of the city in order for them to be actually inserted properly. But don't get me wrong, it's not that these applications are unimportant. Rather, they ignore the vast set of services that a city delivers and the majority of the budget, except transportation. And it does not address the problem of coordination that exists at the core of our city. Consequently, because it doesn't address the coordination problem, we can end up with a city operating system that looks like this. A digital Rube Goldberg machine where pieces, all these small, minimal applications of smart technology have to be patched together, connected in ways that keep everything working together, that holds it together, almost in the sense of chewing gum and elastic bands. Now you may think, isn't AI going to save the day? Before we get to that, let's understand the difficulty of the task first. The future city fallacy is, and a fallacy in this case, is a mistaken belief, especially one based on an unsound argument. The fallacy is in viewing a city as a system we can control. Okay? We tend to view technology.
Could you try?
Oops, my phone went off. We tend to view technology as a solution to our problem. And in fact, we tend to view these days neural nets as a solution to all problems. Well, let's think that one through. Can we solve the problem of managing a city through a neural net? Can we build a neural net that's going to manage all aspects of the city? If you read the papers, you believe the hype, if you've drunk the Kool-Aid, then you'll come back and say yes. But I think the best analogy in this case is just because we can build a neural net to recognize objects in images doesn't mean we can build one to run a city. That's like saying that because my toddler can build a sandcastle, they are now able to build Casa Loma or the CN Tower. Okay? The issue that we're facing in a city is complexity and uncertainty works against us. The city is one of the most complex systems you can possibly imagine. We often hear the phrase brain surgery or rocket science as being incredibly complex. And in reality, it is nowhere near as complex as what it goes on in a city. Within the world of neurosurgery, within the world of aerospace, we can actually scope the problem. We can actually reduce the problem by ignoring certain external variables, external effects that exist out there. That is, we can define the problem in such a way that it's solvable. With a city, you can't do that. And the number of variables boggles the mind. So the complexity of the city is enormous. But at the same time, we face high levels of uncertainty. Things don't happen when we would like them to happen. Or as they used to say in the world of war, that the best laid plans are thrown out the door at the sound of the first shot. Uncertainty exists all around us, whether it's uncertainty due to weather, whether uncertainty due to illness, whether uncertainty due to breakdown of equipment, and it goes on and on and on. It's all there and making it difficult to actually view the system as something we can control. So instead of viewing a system as this monolithic thing that we can control, we need to view it as being composed of thousands of independent agents performing millions of activities, operating in loose coordination according to a set of rules and laws imposed by society and subject to a set of other laws not under our control. Okay? So I want to make sure you understand cities are highly complex and highly uncertain and not subject to centralized control. And some of the laws that affect our ability to control include Murphy's Law, what can go wrong will go wrong. Molt's Law, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy, which I mentioned earlier. Billings' Law, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, meaning that rather than solving the problems we need, we solve the ones that squeak the most. And my own law that says there will always be people who work the system to their own benefit, or for every rule, there's someone who is ready and willing to break it. So the challenge is, if we are to manage the complexity and uncertainty inherent in a city, we need a different way of thinking about the digital systems that increasingly operate and manage our cities. Or, as I actually wrote back in a paper I published in 1981, complexity and uncertainty are two opposing forces, complexity forcing a distribution of tasks, ultimately resulting in a hierarchical structure, and uncertainty pushing in the opposite direction, vertically integrating tasks in a more hierarchical structure. Now, let's go back and ask the question. What are we going to do to manage the city's operations? What is the city OS going to be? Well, as I said, it will not be originally engineered monolithic software architecture. We don't know how to build those things. It will not be a deep neural network. We don't know how to build that for this problem. Using another type of technology, it will not be a rigidly orchestrated set of software applications that fail in the face of the unexpected. That is, it will not be the sea of services where there is some type of orchestration, which is defined by rigid processes. Instead, it will be a network of intelligent agents dynamically interacting to flexibly and contextually achieve the goals of the city and residents, which means that we will have one or more agents that work in the area of social services. Those agents will interact with the agents in the public health area, which will interact with the agents in the housing area, which will interact with the agents in the education area, with the goal of all of these to meet the needs of both the city and the residents of the city, to satisfy what those needs are, and to do it in an efficient and equitable way possible. And not only are they interacting with these 4 agents or these 4 services using multiple agents, but all of the different services, and this isn't all of the services I'm showing, all of these services will have their own avatars operating throughout the city, working together to achieve the vast number of tasks and satisfying the myriad of needs. Okay, let's move on to the second part of the presentation. Before I start talking about the behavioral requirements, let me digress for a moment. I lived in the US from 1975 to 91. I remember having to go to a government office to get a marriage license. I was amazed at the office staff's behavior. They sat at their desks talking to each other, reading the newspaper, ignoring me. And when they did deign to help me, they were surly and unhelpful. Contrast that when I returned to Toronto in 1991, I had to go to City Hall for a parking permit. The people smiled, were friendly, and very helpful. So I asked the question, what type of experience do you want to have with a city? What type of experience do you want to have with a city when the city operating system is fast becoming the primary means by which citizens and corporations interact with the city? Think about it. More and more of our interactions with the city are online, especially in this time of COVID. All of our interactions are online. And so what's happening is the city operating system, the system that underlies all of our interactions with the city, is not simply a tool, but the primary face of the city. So I ask the question, how do we want to interact with this city? And more importantly, how do we want the city operating system to behave when the city and the city operating system are essentially the same thing? Think about that. How do we want the operating system to behave? This is a major step forward in thinking about how the city is to be run. I'm going to talk about 4 different dimensions of city operating system behavior. One is awareness, second is adaptability, third is creativity, and fourth is accountability. I'm going to go through each one of these separately because they represent the core of what I'm presenting today. They represent a view of the city operating system that is understood, explored, and required along behavioral dimensions and not just along technical or functional dimensions. So what does it mean to be aware? Being aware means that the city operating system has to be more than just sensing the environment. It has to know what to expect, what the limits are on performance, on behavior, on what is being observed out there. It has to recognize deviations from the expectation, and it has to know who to inform whenever these deviations occur. There are 3 levels of this awareness. One is the sensing level. Awareness begins with basic data provided by a number of sources. While we tend to focus on physical sensors as a major source of data, while we tend to focus on physical sensors, a major source of data is you, the human being, the resident in the city. In particular, your cell phone and the apps running on it are a major source of data, and hence we are essentially a human sensor net, which is feeding data directly into the city's information systems, into that city operating system. Be clear about that. We are already an extension of the city operating system. The second level of awareness is, in essence, being self-aware. And this is really, really important, that the city operating system has to be aware of when it's operating outside of its limits, rules, or policy, when it is failing to achieve its goals. It could be as simple as sensors that are operating out of range, or it could be more complex, like service provisioning, running late, scheduled activities not being completed. It could be focusing on human resources and employee performance or lack of performance. It can focus on governance and how we're dealing with city requests, not responding in time to them. It can focus self-awareness on the finances of the city and when we're going over budget or when money is being diverted to areas that it shouldn't be diverted. Its self-awareness has to recognize when deviations are occurring, when they are, and most importantly, when they are significant, and who to contact when they occur. The third level of awareness is to detect patterns. Detecting patterns means that we have to analyze digital traces. We have to analyze the digital traces in the area of policing in order to identify areas of concern, both from the point of view of crime that may be occurring, but also in terms of police behavior in this time. Transportation, the digital traces of backups in traffic, etc. Responses to emergencies, the digital traces of fraud that's occurring, the digital traces of welfare abuse or the abuse of services on the people who are receiving social services. It's bidirectional. And finally, the fourth level of awareness is the ability to predict events. That is, developing models based upon the digital traces that are left out there by not only the city operating system, but our cell phones and everything else, to be able to predict events, behaviors that may occur in the future so that we can plan to deal with them. The second dimension of behavior that we have to consider for the city operating system is the ability to do the right thing by flexibly responding to events with a focus on outcomes and not means. This goes back to what I was talking about earlier, that the city operating system is not going to be the sea of services that have these process plans that are used to orchestrate responses, because once a plan is defined, that's always going to be the response. Instead, we have to be driven by what the problem is, and we have to flexibly respond to the problem, focusing on outcome and not the means. The levels of that include being situationally aware. Situationally aware means having access to all the information. A good example came out of Chicago, that when the police respond to a call, they're not only provided with what the location is and the nature of the call, they're also provided with information as to whether anything else has occurred at that address or in that area in the past. And so they have a better idea of the situation when they arrive as to whether this is something that's a new event or it's a repetitive event. So one has to modify their behavior appropriately. Having access to all the information relevant to a particular situation gives access, or makes it possible to assess what the appropriate responses should be to a given situation. Secondly, we have to be able to flexibly respond. We have to transition from that single rigid response to a set of alternatives that are situation or context dependent. Third, we have to be adaptive. And this means replacing process with goals. That is to say, rather than have a set of alternative ways of responding to a situation, we also have the ability to understand what the outcome is that we want to achieve and to be able to dynamically construct solutions that best address the situation in order to achieve the outcome. This means that we have to be aware of the constraints on what can be done, the resources that are available, the context in which things are occurring in order to dynamically construct a solution. The third dimension of the behavior of a city operating system is to be creative, constructing new, better ways of achieving goals. And in order to do that, we have to be diagnostic in our approach. We have to be able to diagnose the root causes as to why things failed in the past and how we're going to proceed going forward. We have to have access to the digital traces of what occurs out there. We have to have access to provenance, to causal relations, in order to understand diagnostically why things ended up the way they did. We have to have empowerment. We have to give the ability or empower either the people or the digital avatars the ability to construct better solutions and execute them and to provide them with the information that they need. And third, we have to be creative in the sense of optimization. We have to look at the solution not only from the narrow context in which the problem exists, but in the broader context in which it interacts with other parts of the city, other areas around where that problem may arise. The fourth dimension of the city operating system behavior is accountability. And this is just as important, if not more important, for the city operating system. Cities must be held accountable for their actions. The city operating system must be held accountable for its actions. In order to do that, we need to be able to determine why a particular outcome resulted. We need to figure out who or what is responsible. Do we have the digital trail of information, activities, and agents that contribute to a particular decision? Can we determine what factors contribute to the situation and who is responsible for those factors? Are we introspective enough? Can we build a level of introspection into the city operating system that can determine why decisions were made? Honest mistake, poor judgment, biased, favored treatment, conflicts of interest, illegal behavior. All of these are possible reasons why a particular decision was made. We have to be able to not only look at a particular situation, but we also have to look at recurring patterns of behavior and their connections with other interested parties. Finally, we need to have in the city operating system an advocate, a digital ombudsman, one who is continually looking at the system, looking at who or what is accountable for the actions that the city operating system is taking, and one who determines ultimately how to respond to accountability issues. So those are the four behavioral dimensions that we need for the city operating system of future cities. What are we doing to move towards that? I'm going to briefly talk about two technologies, briefly because I only have about 10 minutes left. One is intelligent agents, the other is city data or ontologies, and then I will conclude. The city operating system, from a layered perspective, has a number of components to it. The operating system of the future, of course, needs a knowledge layer in which there is a rich representation of data. Within the world of artificial intelligence, we refer to these things as ontologies. There needs to be an agent layer where we have the ability to create agents that can sense and monitor what's going on in the world and perform services within the service sectors, whether it's housing or education or water and sanitation, etc. These agents solve problems, provide services, etc. There needs to be a coordination layer which allows agents to interact with each other, to communicate and dynamically coordinate how they go about solving problems so that agents don't solve problems independent of each other, but do it in a well-coordinated manner. We need to have a management layer which is providing direction to the agents in terms of the goals and constraints that they must be achieving. And there also needs to be a market layer where external agents can interact with the city operating system, where bids and contracts and commitments can be made amongst agents not only within the city operating system, but outside of the city operating system with third-party systems. Last 40 years, I and my colleagues who I've worked with and colleagues around the world have been developing technologies for each of these layers. Within our own group of researchers, we've developed ontologies for both enterprises and cities. We've developed agent reasoning capabilities using constraint-directed reasoning. We've developed coordination, communication processes, protocols, etc. We've developed distributed problem-solving methods and distributed agent architectures, and we've developed market layer capability contracting, for example, across supply chains. So we've attacked bits and pieces of this whole problem. Give you an example of what I mean by an agent architecture within this city operating system. Imagine that there are two agents, one for engineering construction, the other for transportation, let's say in the city of Toronto. Each of those agents would have their own reasoning capabilities, goal and constraint-directed reasoning. These agents would share goals and constraints. In particular, this agent could provide goals and constraints to this other agent, in essence, or for example, goal, remove routes on Bay Street for the period of September-December to 2020. This agent would provide that to the transportation agent. In essence, what this agent is doing is influencing the behavior of this agent. It's saying, if you're going to be doing transportation planning, then please remove this. Of course, that agent can come back and say, hey, I have a problem here. And so there's another layer of interaction that occurs, which is a coordination protocol layer, in which agents can be proposing, countering, accepting, rejecting. So in essence, what this agent is doing is proposing to this agent to remove routes on Bay Street. This agent has the ability to accept or reject it or counter it with alternative times, etc. Within these agents, there is a knowledge base. In the construction agent, it has knowledge of projects, location, time, assets, routes. This one, transportation agent, may have routes, location, time, and assets. The problem with having multiple agents with their own knowledge bases is that over time, information is going to be duplicated and errors may arise, or they may not be consistent with each other. So there's another layer that is needed of provenance and validity that allows us to determine how this knowledge over here depends upon the knowledge over here, and to what extent it's still valid or not valid, and what changes have to be promulgated across the agents. So this agent here, from a construction perspective, may have received information from the transportation agent saying there's a route provided by transportation on May 1st, 2019. So this agent may be working with old knowledge, and going back to the transportation agent may have to get newer versions of that knowledge. So, as I was saying, a variety of technologies have been developed over the years, over the decades, to support these types of interactions, as you see it depicted. The second technology I wish to cover is in city data ontologies. The challenge we have with city data is what's referred to as semantic interoperability, the ability of computer systems to exchange data with unambiguous shared meaning. An example here is Parks and Recreation. When they use the word plant, is not necessarily interpreted the same way in water and sanitation. And so a requirement for agents to be able to operate, interact, coordinate is that we have to have a shared unambiguous understanding of the terminology that's there. The technology that we use is what's referred to as an ontology. Ontologies answer the questions, what are the core concepts and properties that span the domain's data? and to what extent can we generalize them, and importantly, what are the key distinctions in the core concepts that distinguish one concept from another, and can we formally define the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be an example of a concept? This is very important. It's more than a reference model. It is a representation of the definitions of the concepts in a domain using a precise formal language, in other words, logic, to define the meaning of concepts and properties embedded in the data. Quickly, when I referred to an ontology, I'm referring to the next three components. The lowest level is a knowledge graph, in which you represent knowledge using a graph formalism. The nodes represent classes and instances, and the arcs represent properties. If we look at the domain of transportation planning, where you're trying to predict transportation demand over a multi-decade horizon, then we need to predict how, or simulate how, the city will change over those decades, how the households will change in terms of whether households will increase in size due to births, decrease due to deaths, people moving out, teenagers moving out, new households being created due to marriages, because it's these households that represent the source of demand for transportation. So at the knowledge graph level, we need to represent residents, households, members of households, the transportation network, vehicles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The next level of an ontology is a representation of definitions and constraints. This is where logic comes into play. It's where we define concepts such as a resident. Toronto resident resides in, owns property, or owns or operates a business in Toronto. Or a household is composed of at least one person who resides at the same address. We use logic to represent these definitions of these concepts. And the third level is what we refer to as microtheories. These are axioms or rules for performing deduction, for answering questions. For example, for each year above the age of 14, a member of a household will leave with a probability of P of age. A knowledge graph, at the knowledge graph level, we can capture the key concepts in the definition of Toronto resident, where we have representation of the concept of resident, Toronto resident, and properties such as owns property in, an address in a city, a business has an address, a Toronto resident operates a business, a Toronto resident resides in Toronto. This is our knowledge graph representation of this definition, but it doesn't actually represent the definition. It just represents the components of the definition. The actual representation of the definition of a Toronto resident requires the introduction of the logical formalism, where Toronto resident is a subclass of resident and resides in Toronto, or owns property in Toronto, or owns a business, and that business has an address, and that address is in the city of Toronto. So it's a combination of the identified components, classes, properties, etc., at the knowledge graph level, that are then combined using logic to provide us with definitions, which we can use for reasoning, which I'm not going to go into detail at this moment. Over the decades, we have developed a number of ontologies. We've developed the TOVE Enterprise ontology for representing resources, activities, processes, organization, quality, cost, provenance, validity. This is the work of many people within my group over the years. We've more recently developed a city indicator ontologies to represent indicators, city indicators across education, energy, environment, finance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have developed even more recently the iCity TPSO ontology that covers concepts such as household, buildings, vehicles, travel costs, parking, public transit, land use, trip, and urban systems. And even more recently, we have developed the Common Indicator Data Standard for the social services sector, which allows us to represent their impact models covering stakeholders, outcome, impact, indicator, program, service, activity. A number of these ontologies are finding their way into standards. For example, the iCity TPSO ontology is the basis of a new standard that ISO IEC 5087 represents. That standard has 3 levels: a foundation level for representing time, location, etc., a city level for representing concepts that are general to cities and span many of the services, such as household services, residences, and at a service level, concepts that span a particular service area but are shared by other services. The 5087-3 is being created, and I'm the editor of these standards for transportation planning. We will introduce subsequently standards for water and safe sanitation, education, public safety, et cetera, et cetera. The 5087 starting standards for these parts cover these concepts at the foundation level: resources, observations, organization, agent, agreement, part of, etc. At the city level: land use, building, household, person, organization, etc. And at the transportation planning level, transit vehicle, etc. Are there. So what I've done is I've shown you 2 technologies that we have been exploring, technologies for agents, intelligent agents, and technologies for city data using ontologies. So in conclusion, what I want to say is that the information architectures currently proposed for smart cities are fundamentally flawed. And they're fundamentally flawed because they have this almost a very rigid view that does not deal well with the complexity and uncertainty in the environment. Instead, we require an architecture that can dynamically respond to the ever-changing world in which we live. So in order to bring order to the potential chaos, intelligent agents must adhere to a code of behavior. That is absolutely important, that we not only have this distributed agent architecture, but these agents must adhere to a code of behavior. In order for them not only to perform a function, but behave in a way that a smart city should be, bringing harmony, accountability, trust, and equality to the function of the city. And finally, even though I said at the beginning that Townsend in his Smart City book didn't capture the real complexity and the real focus of a urban operating system, a city operating system, there's one quote I'd like to leave you with, which I think is very apropos, which is, "But the real killer app for smart cities, new technologies, is the survival of our species. The coming century of urbanization is humanity's last attempt to have our cake and eat it too, to double down on industrialization by redesigning the operating system of the last century to cope with the challenges of the coming one." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. We have already some questions posted. Let me begin with the first one. The current crisis revealed many structural flaws in our societies and urban centers. How will this crisis affect the design of urban centers?
Well, there's 2 answers to that. There's one answer which is based on the city operating system, which I've talked about. If you believe what I said, if you believe what the code of behavior should be, if you believe the distributed approach and the goal-driven approach, then a city operating system, a city of the future based upon such an operating system will be more resilient and more adaptable to the problems that we are experiencing today. I'm not saying that that solution is available today. We are slowly moving in that direction, but it makes it possible to address a number of the issues that we're facing today in terms of resilience, adaptability, dynamic allocation of resources, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, what we are experiencing today is, in essence, the failure of the existing systems that we have in place. And I'm not saying that from the point of view of that we failed in the design of our existing systems. It's just that these systems are legacy systems, and they are limited in what they can do to deal with the current situation.
Speaking of today, the next question is very timely. What will be the impact of 5G wireless technology on facilitating these smart services?
I see that all the time. What's 5G going to do? What's 5G going to do? I mean, 5G is going to make things faster, right? I mean, we get 2 orders of magnitude increase in speed with 5G. That's great. What it means is a qualitative change in our experience with everything that is information oriented. So what it means is if you dream about an augmented reality or virtual reality as you walk down the street, 5G makes that possible. We may not have the content to support it at this time. We may not have all the software we need to support it, but a lot of things becomes doable because vast amounts of information can be communicated in a very short period of time. So think about all of the things that you could have access to that if it was readily available at your fingertips would help in whatever it is that you're doing. Augmented reality is just one thing that comes to my mind, but there's lots of other applications.
The next question's fairly long. How do we overcome the political obstacles that block or hinder progress towards the more dynamic city that we need? Often we find politicians here and in countries like the United States at all levels of government that undermine these efforts either by pushing the script of, quote, increasing costs or taxes, or B, by oversimplifying the interactions of cities, services, and agents as being simple, straightforward, end-user exchanges. Further, how do we eliminate the oversimplified and short-sighted mindset of NIMBYism that prevails? A rather lengthy question. I don't know whether you're
no. I something. I interact with cities around the world, and I certainly interact with a number of departments at the City of Toronto. So I'll say this for the City of Toronto. Those who don't my interactions with the city are very different than I think the essence of the comment. That is to say, my interactions with the city are based upon interactions with people who are smart, with people who are willing to change things, with people who have vision, and so it is the case that throughout the City of Toronto, there are people who have the characteristics that you would like to see moving forward in building that operating system for future cities, for doing things smarter and smarter. But at the same time, there are other people who aren't. But that's reality. That's life. Okay. And what we can hope for is that we continue to promote the people who are farsighted, not risk adverse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in positions of responsibility. And in the City of Toronto, I see lots of people of that type who are less risk adverse, who are future thinking, et cetera. It's not as negative here in the City of Toronto. City of Montreal is the same way. Very forward thinking. Vancouver, forward thinking. Edmonton, forward thinking. Calgary, forward thinking. A lot of good people in those cities. At the same time, we only really see the negative things because that's the types of things that get reported as opposed to the positive things that people are working on.
Next question from Patrick Howell. Creatively, coming up with solutions to problems based on data seems like a tailor-made problem for AI. Do you envision this pillar of the operating system being done with machine learning, or is this the part that would require some human intervention?
So, my background is artificial intelligence. And so everything I do is artificial intelligence, but not everything I do, or most of the stuff I do, is not neural nets. Okay, neural nets have a role to play, primarily in situations that are pattern recognition based. That is, if we have training data and we have examples of what we do, how we want to behave in certain situations, then neural nets may be an appropriate technology. But there was recently a recent distinguished lecture at University of Toronto by a person who compared neural nets against other techniques and showed that when dealing with sparse qualitative data, which is not image understanding or speech understanding, et cetera, or well, et cetera, that other techniques perform as well and more easily understood. Secondly, a number of things that I've been talking about, which is teleological in nature, goal-based, are not amenable to the neural net techniques. And in the middle of my presentation, I made the case that there is not going to be a neural net that controls everything. It is impossible at this time. Who knows? Maybe 200 years from now. I don't know. I can't say no to anything, but we do not have the ability to create neural nets that control everything. Nevertheless, the intelligent agents, the coordination theories, the constraint-based reasoning, the ontologies, those are all areas within artificial intelligence. So are we going to be using artificial intelligence to achieve the city operating system for future cities? Absolutely yes. Are we using other information communication technologies? Absolutely yes. It will be an interesting hybrid combination of all of these technologies, but artificial intelligence, not necessarily neural nets, not only neural nets, will play an important role.
Next question is a short one. Are the ideas for a city operating system and its characteristics being applied to other ecosystems, such as at the provincial government level?
Are these ideas? Well, let me give you the example of the ontology piece. So I'm not talking about the agents, but I'm talking about the knowledge representation, the representation of data. I mentioned earlier that we have this common indicator data standard that we developed for the social services area. That work is funded by both the provincial and federal government of Canada, and the Ontario government and the federal government. That is being made into a countrywide, a national standard for the representation of data for social purpose organizations to allow for the communication, sharing, and analysis and benchmarking of the performance of social service organizations, social purpose organizations across Canada. So this is actually not only being adapted at the provincial and federal level, but it's being motivated by the provincial and federal level.
Thank you. Before we continue, and I notice people are beginning to leave because our scheduled stop time was 1 o'clock, but Professor Fox has indicated he's willing to continue for a few more minutes to answer questions, but I just wanted to let you know that the next Lunch and Learn will be virtual, will be Wednesday, November 11th. Every year we try to invite a student group. This year we actually have 3 students from the Department of Engineering Science. We'll be talking about their transformative international experiences for engineering students having studied abroad, and they're going to share those experiences with us on Wednesday, November 11th. Again, you will be getting a notification as to registration. In fact, I believe the registration link is already on the Skule Lunch and Learn website. And on that note, let us return to a couple of more questions. One, does this research relate to the Urban Genome Project?
Okay, for those who don't know, I'm a co-lead of the Urban Genome Project. That is one of the urban challenges that are funded by the School of Cities, Urban Challenge Initiative. The Urban Genome Project is actually in some ways much further into the future and a lot more basic research than what I'm referring to. So will the Urban Genome Project eventually feed into the city operating system? Yes. Are we working on that at this time? No. That's a future thing for us. if you go to the School of Cities website, schoolofcities.org or .com, I think, you can go into the Urban Challenge section and find out more about the Urban Genome Project.
Another question or comment from David Gallagher. To what extent do you think smart buildings will form a part of the foundation of smart cities? Lots of software companies are working on digital twins or building operating systems which sound similar to the urban operating system which you have been talking about. So
I actually have done some work in the area of smart buildings. The operating system for a building is a pale version of the operating system for a city. If you think about all of the services that a city provides, there's a very small number of services that a building provides. A building can actually, I believe, be managed using a monolithic system. Now, do I believe that an agent-based architecture can be used within a building? The answer is absolutely yes. But I don't believe what people are referring to as smart buildings today is very much related to what I've been talking about, the city operating system for future cities. I mean, there's certainly sensors in a smart building. There's certainly control systems. There's certainly rule-based systems to change the environment. There's certainly systems that recognize people, open doors, stuff like that. But this is all relatively small compared to what goes on within a city.
Next question, and it also was submitted in advance of your presentation online. How quickly do you think vehicular and asset OEMs are reacting to this move into a more connected city, i.e., are they doing enough? Is there more to be done? Do you think these companies will open themselves and their data connecting to an open city network?
So the issue here isn't whether the OEMs, and this is not restricted to vehicles. It's any type of asset that the city uses or interacts with the city. This isn't an issue of them opening up. It's an issue of the city requiring that they open up. That is to say, cities put out RFPs for various asset purchases, whether it's within transportation or water and sanitation or housing, whatever the case may be. It's up to the city to now say, if you are going to be a provider of assets, whether it be physical or software assets, then you have to satisfy this requirement. And that requirement being that you have to open up your asset to data and protocol standards that allow for greater sharing of information, and in the long run, allowing for greater cooperation, coordination of those assets within the larger view of the city. So we have to address this on the demand side. That is, what is the city demanding? And if the city says you have to do it, then the providers of those assets will do that.
Thank you. One last question, a fairly short general question. Do you have any recommended readings on the topic of city operating systems or smart cities in general?
Well, the Townsend book is an interesting book, 2013, on smart cities. But as I said, from a city operating system point of view, I don't agree with his view. But it's a good book on smart cities. On the other hand, I think you're going to have to wait until I finally sit down and write my article on the urban operating system or the city operating system. So if you send me emails to bug me to finish writing my paper on the city operating system, then you'll have something to read.
Good. Well, we are beginning to run out of time. To give you time to write that article or that book, in closing, I would like to thank you, Mark, We've had a lot of questions. For me, this has been a unique experience to do Lunch and Learn online. I'd much sooner do it at the faculty club, but unfortunately in these pandemic times, that just is not going to be possible. So thank you again, and I would encourage anybody to register for the next Lunch and Learn on Wednesday, November 11th. Again, it will be virtual, and you can register on the Skule Lunch and Learn website. So thank you, everybody, especially those that stuck out for the extra few minutes of questions. And Mark, thank you for handling all of these questions today. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me. Appreciate it.